glad you made accent.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
This is most likely
Let's go ahead
happened
and
because
start.
of the things he said.
I begin with the fact that there is a statue of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Westminster Abbey. This is one of 10. These are over the great west door, west front of the cathedral, and it's dedicated to what they call modern martyrs, people who sacrificed themselves for the Christian faith in the 20th century. The lower part of the facade was completed in the 15th century. Westminster Abbey is a very old church. And the niches were evidently intended for statues, but they were never filled, these niches. There was a major restoration of the west front completed in 1995, and that provided an opportunity to have their original purpose fulfilled. The idea was to proclaim, not to commemorate these saints and martyrs of the 20th century, but to proclaim a message of which too few people are aware. The 20th century was a century of Christian martyrdom, and even though these are individual martyrs, the idea is they represent all who have suffered for Christianity, rather from oppression, persecution, and these statues, these 10, were unveiled in 1998 by the Archbishop of Canterbury at a service attended by relatives of the people commemorated, many church leaders, and representatives of different faiths. The Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, and the Queen were there. And these are 10 people from all over the world. I don't even recognize the names of a number of them, but we have Poland, South Africa, Uganda, Russia, and of course Martin Luther King is one of the 10. Oscar Romero, a name some of you might know, he was the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was assassinated. Bonhoeffer from Germany, of course, and Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, China. So they really are, this really is an international group. Okay, well, this is the problem of knowing more about something about one of the topics you're covering than about another, and so I was just drowned in material about Bonhoeffer. So what I'm going to do today is we will look at his life and discuss his letters and papers from prison, the things on religionless Christianity, and then the next time I will start out by mentioning just additional things, like what has his influence been, books about and Bonhoeffer, or books taking off from his thought, and then I will move into Bultmann, who's not as difficult to cover. So, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and there we go. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born on February the 4th, 1906, in Breslau, Germany, the 6th of 8 children. He had a twin, a girl named Sabina. His father was a distinguished professor of neurology and psychiatry. His mother was the granddaughter of a prominent church historian. When Dietrich was 6, his family moved to Berlin. As a child, he loved music, and throughout his life enjoyed singing and playing the piano. and he loved the hymns of Paul Gerhardt, who was a 17th century Lutheran songwriter, hymn writer, and I believe we have 3 of Paul Gerhardt's hymns in the hymnal. Bonhoeffer's post-secondary education was at the universities of Tübingen and Berlin. And he was awarded a doctorate from the University of Berlin in 1927 at the age of 21. Bonhoeffer's doctoral dissertation, The Communion of Saints, was published as a book in 1930, and that introduced some of his most characteristic theological emphases. Central to them was a passionate concern that Christianity be a concrete, active presence in the world, Christ existing as community. Bonhoeffer's theology, like Barth's, was thoroughly Christ-centered, grounded entirely in the Old and New Testament witness to Christ as interpreted by the church's creeds and confessions. After his ordination, Bonhoeffer spent a year, 1928 to 29, as the curate and assistant pastor of a German-speaking congregation in Barcelona, Spain. He then spent the academic year 1930 to 31 as a Sloan Fellow at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He made the most of his time in America. He traveled widely. He was trying to teach these ignorant Americans about what was going on theologically in Europe. He came to love African American spirituals. Among the faculty of Union Seminary was Reinhold Niebuhr, who would play a role in Bonhoeffer's return visit to America in 1939. Okay, I have it marked that I need to move on at this point. Okay, in fall of 1931, Bonhoeffer became a lecturer in theology at the University of Berlin, and his inaugural dissertation was published that year. Now in Germany, at least in those days, you wrote a doctoral dissertation for your degree, and then in order to get a teaching position, you wrote another dissertation, and that was called a Habilitationsschrift, an inaugural dissertation. And the title of his inaugural dissertation was Act and Being. How abstract can you get? It's heavy-duty theological reflection. What's interesting in it is that Bonhoeffer takes on Barth. He also responded critically to Bultmann and Tillich. 2 collections of Bonhoeffer's class lectures during this period were later published. Creation and Fall was published in 1937. That was an interpretation of chapters 1 to 3 of Genesis. And then Christology, which was published posthumously from student notes. Christology foreshadows what would be the central idea of his last writings, that Christ's whole being is his being for others, and his powerlessness and humiliation for our sake are the fullest disclosure of the power and majesty of God. And of course, you can find this theme in St. Paul. For example, 1 Corinthians 1. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. When Hitler came to power in early 1933, Bonhoeffer was one of the earliest German Protestant leaders to grasp and speak out against the demonic implications of Nazism. As a matter of fact, he did a radio broadcast on the Führer principle of the leader, and was cut off during the broadcast. Bonhoeffer was one of the organizers of the Pastors Emergency League, which I I mentioned last week in connection with Barth, which became the nucleus of the confessing church of anti-Nazi German Protestants. While serving as a pastor to a German-speaking congregation in London from 1933 to 35, Bonhoeffer got around. He traveled a bit out of Germany. Bonhoeffer cultivated ecumenical contacts with and sought the support of international Christian leaders for the Protestants in Germany who were resisting Nazism. He worked particularly closely with George K.A. Bell, do I have that? Yeah. The Anglican Bishop of Chichester in southern England. Okay. I'm ready to go. Bonhoeffer did not participate in the 1934 Synod of Barmen, which again I mentioned last week, because he was in England. But he became a very active member of the confessing church, and he rallied other pastors to support Barmen, the declaration. In 1935, he returned to Germany and founded a clandestine seminary to train pastors for the confessing church. The seminary was located chiefly at Finkenwalde, which was a suburb of Stettin, an industrial town in eastern Germany, which is now in Poland. It continued despite Gestapo harassment until 1937. Bonhoeffer organized the seminary as a living workshop in Christian community and developed close relationships with his students. One of his students was a man named Eberhard Bethke. Bethke became Bonhoeffer's closest friend and later the recipient of most of his letters from prison. It's entirely due to Eberhard Bethke that Bonhoeffer and his thought are widely known and have had an international influence. After Bonhoeffer's death, Bethke became the editor of all his published and unpublished writings and wrote what is still the definitive biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's published in German in 1967 and then in English in 1970. It's over 800 pages long. It's a monumental biography. Out of the Finkenwalde experiment came two more books by Bonhoeffer. One was The Cost of Discipleship, which was a clarion call to active obedience to Christ based on the Sermon on the Mount. And the other was Life Together, published in 1939. That was a study of Christian community based on the Finkenwalde experience. And I think apart from the letters and papers, those are the two most widely known books of Bonhoeffer. And The Cost of Discipleship brings me to justification by faith. Because this book is best known for Bonhoeffer's criticism of what he called cheap grace, setting it in contrast to costly grace. Bonhoeffer clearly believed, with Luther and Barth, that humans are justified or accepted by God entirely by God's free gift of grace received in faith or trust, and not by anything we do. However, he insisted strongly that Luther's rediscovery of the free grace of justification had been misinterpreted and cheapened by the German Lutheran tradition. And here's just a little bit of what he says. Cheap grace means grace as a doctrine, a principle, a system. It means forgiveness of sins proclaimed as a general truth, the love of God taught as the Christian conception of God. Cheap grace means the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. Grace alone does everything, they say, and so everything can remain as it was before. The world goes on in the same old way, and we are still sinners, even in the best life, as Luther said. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. And then, by contrast, costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs man his life, and it is grace because it gives man the only true life. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. So, and he develops this idea of saying, directed specifically at the Lutheran tradition, and its cheapening of Luther's great insight. As war became increasingly inevitable in 1939, friends at Union Theological Seminary arranged an American lecture tour for Bonhoeffer with the understanding that he could stay indefinitely. The idea was to get him out of there. Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich were both involved in making the arrangements. But Bonhoeffer realized that he had made a mistake in leaving Germany with war imminent. Only 6 weeks after his arrival in New York, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany. He explained his reasons in a letter to Niebuhr. Have I done with it? Yes. He says, I have made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. And he goes on to say, Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security. After his return to Germany, Bonhoeffer was forbidden to speak in public or to publish. He became a participant in the German resistance. Through the efforts of his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, and General Hans Oster of the Foreign Office, Bonhoeffer became a civilian employee of the Abwehr, German military counterintelligence. Just a footnote on Hans von Dohnanyi. Just a few weeks ago, September the 6th, one of the best known, most famous symphony orchestra conductors in the world died 2 days short of his 96th birthday. His name was Christoph von Dohnanyi, and he was the son of Hans von Dohnanyi and Christina Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer's sister. Von Dohnanyi was a prominent lawyer, but and also a leader in the resistance, and his wife participated in the resistance, Christina Bonhoeffer. Another brother-in-law of Bonhoeffer's was Rüdiger Schleicher, who was married to Bonhoeffer's sister, Ursula. So being involved in the resistance was kind of a family affair. And when I visited the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 2008, it's very near Berlin, I saw the memorial tablet with the names of Hans von Knochenanyi and Rüdiger Schleifer on it. They were both imprisoned there and then executed. Ironically but usefully, the Abwehr was under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who presided over what was in part a cover for German resistance activity. Canaris himself was later executed for treason. Traveling with an official passport and at government expense, Bonhoeffer several times visited neutral Switzerland and Sweden, and also occupied Norway. On these secret visits, he maintained contact with ecumenical church leaders, transmitting information on the situation in Germany and resistance plans to seize control of the German government with the fall of Hitler. Through his resistance contacts, Bonhoeffer learned that his friend Bishop Bell was in Sweden, and he met with him there. Bonhoeffer appealed for official Allied assurances that if the planned assassination of Hitler was successful, the war would be ended immediately. Bishop Bell relayed the message to the British Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden, but the Allies were already committed to unconditional surrender. The story of the significant resistance to Hitler in Germany before and during World War II has never really been told very much. A very fine book was written by one of the surviving members of the resistance, Fabian von Schlabrendorf. He wrote a book called The Secret War Against Hitler, which was published in 1966, and it's really quite good. It goes in, and of course it includes material on Bonhoeffer. During his time with the Abwehr, Bonhoeffer also managed to help smuggle several Jews out of Germany. Between 1940 and his arrest in 1943, Bonhoeffer also found time to work on a study of Christian ethics. I'm sorry. I got behind myself. I'm sorry. To work on a study of Christian ethics, which was grounded in the biblical Christ as the concrete unity between God and the world. During the war, the sections he completed were buried in containers in the garden of the Bonhoeffer family home, and they were dug up by Bethke and others after the war. Bethke edited and published these portions of the book that Bonhoeffer had written under the title Ethics. Interestingly, in June of 1939, Bonhoeffer had been invited by John Bailey, one of the prominent Scottish theologians, to deliver a series of lectures at the University of Edinburgh, and hoped to make the lectures the basis for the book on ethics. But of course, the outbreak of the war at the beginning of September prevented that. In January 1943, Bonhoeffer became engaged to Maria von Wedemeyer. She was much younger than Bonhoeffer, who had been a friend of her family for some years. In April, he was arrested and was incarcerated for 2 years, mainly in Tegel prison in Berlin. During his imprisonment, Bonhoeffer carried on correspondence with Bethke, Maria, and his parents and other family members. And Maria was able to visit him, I think, about once a month when he was imprisoned. He also wrote a number, and Letters and Papers includes all these things. Letters and Papers from prison. He also wrote a number of poems. My favorite is one called Who Am I? And where he explores the difference between the face he presents to his fellow prisoners and guards and his own inner struggles. And it's very good. He writes reflective essays, such as a sermon for the wedding of Eberhard to Bonhoeffer's niece, Renata Schleicher. He wrote thoughts when their first child was born. He wrote reflections on the baptism of the child, who was a boy named, guess what, Dietrich. And as a matter of fact, Bonhoeffer was both his uncle and his godfather. And reflections on the previous 10 years. After the war, Bethke published Letters and Papers from Prison, 1951. Through the years that followed, Bethke published successive, ever enlarged editions as he included more and more of the prison correspondence. So it eventually grew to about 450 pages. And it's got really interesting, including Maria von Wedemeyer's letter exchange with Bonhoeffer. After the failed attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, in 1944, evidence came to light that incriminated Bonhoeffer. You probably have a general idea of the July 20th plot, that the person actually carrying out the attempted assassination was a German colonel named Klaus von Stauffenberg. And the resistance included both civilians and military people. And he was the one, as a military person, who was able to get close enough to Hitler's inner circle that he could do this. And that it did not succeed was a completely fluke. Hitler lived a charmed life. He escaped several assassination attempts. Anyway, if there was a movie made just a few years ago called Valkyrie, that was the code name for the assassination attempt. It starred Tom Cruise as von Stauffenberg. I thought he did a very good job in the role, and it really takes you through the steps leading up to and following the attempted assassination. It was a bomb in a briefcase. After that, Bonhoeffer was transferred to Flossenburg. Well, he was transferred to Buchenwald for a time, and then ultimately to Flossenburg, which was an execution site where he was hanged on April 9th, 1945. And just something about his final days. This is from a book by Martin Marty, a distinguished American church historian, who himself died only a few months ago. And this is a whole book about letters and papers from prison, the writing, Bethke's editing, the publication, the influence. And so he has this, Marty has this, these lines. On February 7th, he was moved to Buchenwald near Weimar, where he was given a basement cell. British Captain Payne Best, who was a fellow prisoner who survived the war, wrote a book about those days called the Venlo Incident. And this is what Payne Best had to say. Bonhoeffer was all humility and sweetness. He always seemed to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy in every smallest event in life, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact of being alive. He was one of the very few men I ever met to whom his God was real and lived close to him. And Best was there the morning before his death, Bonhoeffer's death in Flossenburg. And Bonhoeffer was speaking to fellow prisoners. It was a kind of little service he was conducting. And it was not long before the door was opened and two civilians called out, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, get ready and come with us." At the place of execution, he said a short prayer and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. And he left these last words in Payne Best's hearing: "This is the end, for me the beginning of life." I think it was 9 days later that Allied troops liberated Flossenburg. Okay, let's see. Well, during his time in prison, Bonhoeffer was seriously rethinking what Christ and Christianity mean in the modern world, a world he described as come of age and increasingly religionless. Now, interesting, these are the same questions that 19th century liberal Protestantism posed. What is Christianity? What does Christ mean in the modern world? Bonhoeffer's take, his answer is certainly different from that of the liberals, but it's his bold questions and his preliminary theological proposals in prison that defined Bonhoeffer's fame and influence, beginning in the late 1950s. He introduces his project in a letter to Bethke of April 30th, 1944, after a year of reflection in prison. And I distributed to you the first session excerpts from letters and papers as a kind of sampler of what he was working on. I've done this because, unlike our other three Protestant thinkers, Bonhoeffer was thinking these thoughts in prison and presenting them piecemeal in various handwritten letters to Bethke and these were to Bethke, and not in a published book. So you have to, and of course they're talking about lots of other things too. How are mother and dad doing, and so what I did was to try to extract this material from the letters and papers. So I think that's, I guess maybe I have a moment just to do the personal note that I had here. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on Bonhoeffer, on the development of his thought and throughout his career, and then but always with the question in mind, how does it relate to what he says in the prison writings? And then for several years, and this was after much revision, this was published as a book, and that was in 1970. And then for several years, from the mid-70s to the 80s, I was a member of the International Bonhoeffer Society, which met each year in conjunction with the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion, of which I was also a member. And attending regularly at our sessions were Eberhard and Renata Bethke. So, got to meet them, very gracious people. They even had to listen to me present a paper. At the 1975 meeting, a special guest was Maria von Wedemeyer. She was quite a bit younger than Bonhoeffer. She was 18 years younger. After the war, she studied mathematics at University of Frankfurt. She migrated to the United States, took a master's degree at Bryn Mawr, and went on to have a very successful career in the fledgling computer industry. yeah, she worked for Remington Rand Univac, and later she worked for Honeywell. And she is known in the field of computer science for her role in developing emulation capability. I don't know what that is. Anyway, people with a lot of savvy in computer science do. Anyway, her life after the war, she married. She had 2 children, I think, and she oversaw the publication of the letters between her and Bonhoeffer when he was in prison, and wrote an essay about them. And so I got to meet her in 1975, but very sadly, she died of cancer 2 years later at the age of 53. So that's Bonhoeffer's life and death, and how I came to know something about Bonhoeffer. So now, first of all, if you have any questions about what I've been talking about, and then secondly, if you want to we can dive into the excerpts that I passed around from Letters and Papers from Prison.
What do you take from all this as far as for today? I mean, today, about the religionless Christianity?
Well, I'd like to hear from you as to what you made of these remarks. You know, he starts telling Betke that he's for the past year he's been puzzling over what is the meaning of Christianity, what is the meaning of Christ for today, and he's saying that the time of religion, as he's calling it, which he calls the time of inwardness and conscience, the time of inwardness and metaphysical thinking, that is, thinking of God in terms of a being up there or out there. And he was coming to the conclusion that we're actually entering a time of no religion, of an extremely secular time in human history. And so he says, he just raises lots of questions. He says, how can Christ become the Lord of the religionless? Are there religionless Christians?
And
he's
what if he were here today? Compared to back then, it's even a bigger question.
right. But he was kind of recognizing in the midst of war, which was the most terrible conflict in human history, that people can't be religious in the old way anymore. I mean, he's not saying everybody, but he's saying that human civilization is changing in a secular way, and it may be easier to understand what he's talking about here if you're thinking about it in terms of European life and culture, because church attendance, for example, is much lower in Western European countries than it is here. America has always had more of a active, vibrant, religious life than Europe has for the last century or so. So, you have all these historic churches that are mostly empty anymore, and so he's dealing with the whole secularization process.
Well, it seems that Okay, this is my take. It seems that he and Tillich, in a sense, could have a conversation. Bonhoeffer said, live in the midst of life.
Yeah.
I mean, plunge into it.
Mhm.
I mean, because he didn't think the church did. The church veered away from it.
Oh, yeah, well,
And he was saying, plunge in the middle of it, and I think Tillich said something similar, but different, but.
Well, you know, he criticizes, in the material I passed out, he criticizes Barth. He praises him for being the first theologian to begin the criticism of religion. But he criticizes him for stopping short with what Bonhoeffer calls a positivism of revelation or restoration. And later he elaborates on that, and he says, on what he means by positivism of revelation. Like it or lump it, virgin birth, Trinity, or anything else, each is an equally significant and necessary part of the whole, which must simply be swallowed as a whole or not at all. And he says that on the contrary, there are degrees of knowledge and degrees of significance. And that means that a secret discipline must be restored whereby the mysteries of the Christian faith are protected from profanation. And he really, this idea of secret discipline was very important to Bonhoeffer. And you might call what he was doing at this clandestine seminary in Finkenwalde, the community there, that was part of the secret discipline. That is that the Christian community has a life of its own, which is centered on the Bible, the church, worship, prayer, community caring, has a life of its own. But in terms of the world, we must simply participate along with everybody else and not claim anything special for ourselves. One of my favorite passages in this connection is, this is on page 6 of your handout. It says, I'm still discovering right up to this moment that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a churchman, a righteous person. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God and the world. That's the theme that we saw earlier in his thought, that it's Christ crucified who is the power and wisdom of God. So it is the suffering of God in the world. That, I think, is faith. That is metanoia, which means repentance. And that is how one becomes a human being and a Christian. And so he was saying that the Christian, in a way, lives in two worlds. There's the world of the secret discipline, which is the life of the church, and then there is the world in which we fully participate as alongside everybody else, people of other faiths, people of no faith, and so forth, and just take life as it comes. And he goes on to say, he has an outline for a book. And he said, this would be a book of only about 100 pages. And he gives you the topics in the book. And he says, I feel obliged to tackle these questions as one who, although a modern theologian, is still aware of the debt that he owes to liberal theology, which was wrestling with the same kinds of issues. So in the book, what would have been chapter 2, God and the secular, he says, who is God? And of course, he said, we can't be talking about the old Deus ex machina, God out of the machine. This was in Greek theater. Some plays are resolved by cranking a god into the scene and resolving things. But and he's saying too many people think that's the way to think about God. Who is God? Encounter with Jesus Christ. The experience that a transformation of all human life is given in the fact that Jesus is there only for others. And this being there for others, Dasein für andere, is the experience of transcendence. And faith is participation in this being. Our relation to God is not a religious relationship to the highest, most powerful, and best being imaginable, but our relation to God is a new life in existence for others through participation in the being of Jesus. And he talks about what the church needs to do, needs to be in this situation. And I like the statement, the transcendental is not infinite and unattainable tasks, but the neighbor who is within reach. And he raises the question, what do we really believe? I mean, believe in such a way that we stake our lives on it. He thinks, what must I believe is the wrong question. And as it were, giving the answer of, well, this is what the church believes. And he thinks that's the wrong approach. I find the whole notion of a religionless world, and by which, of course, he really is talking about the general secularization of life. But I find it a hard concept to, his characterization of religion is kind of a difficult concept for me to get my mind around. And of course, he was influenced in that by Barth. Barth was a great critic of religion, because religion as the highest human aspiration is also the most susceptible to human idolatry, fallibility, self-seeking, and so forth. But he takes this a step farther. He said Barth stopped short by really reaffirming traditional Christianity in many ways, and that's not enough. So he just, for me, it's the raising of the questions the way he did that is really stimulating,